pulling her close to his chest. "It's for you," he said, his voice subtle and calm, his lips seductive. Sophie could feel butterflies in her stomach, but she waved it off. "Guess someone is drunk," she said, trying to pull him off, but his grip was strong. The sensation was strong for her to handle. "I'm sorry for everything," Zach finally blurted out. "I know I haven't been good to you ever since, but please can we be friends?" he pleaded, his emerald green eyes narrowing and piercing through every walls in her heart. Sophie mustered strength to speak through the sensually thick air that filled the room. "Why the sudden change in attitude?" she asked. Zach leaned his lips forward close to her ears, his breath sending cold shivers down her entire body. He was about to whisper something to her when Ethan walked in on them. He had been looking for her. Sophie pulled away from Zach almost immediately, and Ethan quickly grabbed her by the hand. He gave Zach a deadly look. "Stay away from her," he said. With that, he dragged Sophie away while Zach watched them with a tinge of jealousy. After that day, Zach and Sophie became close. He always teased her and made sure no one ever bullied her again in school. Their friendship blossomed. Ethan became overprotective of her. Sophie, on the other hand, struggled over her emotions for the both of them. One day, while she was trying to pick a book from the library, Ethan walked in and helped her. He playfully held it high above his head, his taller frame easily keeping it out of her reach. "How about you try to get it from me?" he smiled, his smile calm and peaceful. Sophie's eyes found its way to his chest. A few buttons were open, and she couldn't help but stare at his handsomely defined features. Sophie was still lost in her imagination when Ethan's kiss brought her back to reality. His soft lips draped hers passionately. It happened so fast and time seemed to stop for a moment. She gently separated herself from the kiss. Ethan quickly apologized, handed her the book and left. That same day, after a surprise rainstorm, Sophie found herself stuck under a bus stop shelter near the school. She tried to stay dry, huddling close to the side, when Zach appeared out of nowhere, holding a single dripping umbrella. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, shaking water from his hair. Sophie groaned. "You're everywhere, aren't you?" "Only where you are," Zach quipped, opening the umbrella and holding it over both of them. "I can't see your car packed anywhere, and wait. Shouldn't you be hanging out at the party with your friends?" Sophie asked, stepping slightly away to avoid getting too close. "Who needs them when I've got you? As for my car, I told my driver not to come so I can spend time with you," he replied smoothly, moving closer so the umbrella covered them both. Sophie tried not to notice how his wet t-shirt clung to him, or how his green eyes seemed even brighter in the rain. "You're unbelievable." When the rain let up, Zach walked her halfway home, making jokes and teasing her the entire way. As they reached her street, he stopped and turned to her. "Come rain or sunshine, I'll be there for you," he said, giving her a small, crooked smile. Sophie rolled her eyes but couldn't stop the laugh that bubbled out. "Good night, Zach." "Sweet dreams, Sophie," he called after her, watching as she disappeared into her house, a satisfied grin on his face. Sophie became torn as to who she truly wants, Ethan or Zach. Over the weekend, while cleaning her grandmother's room, she went ahead to clean her grandmother's favorite old box, but suddenly it slipped and fell. As she tried gathering pieces of the box, her eyes stumbled upon an old photograph. The image showed her mother, younger and vibrant, standing beside a tall man with sharp features and piercing gray eyes. Sophie froze. She had seen those eyes before. Beneath the photo was a folded letter. Her hands trembled as she opened it and began to read. Dearest Damien, I don't know why you choose to leave now. I needed you the most. I am heartbroken, but no matter how much I try to hate you, I just can't. Our child needs you. Please come back to us. Caroline. The words hit Sophie like a tidal wave. Damien Steele. Ethan's father was once her mother's lover. Could she be the product of their love? Does that make Ethan her stepbrother? Her chest tightened as questions and realizations spiraled through. That evening, Sophie sat across from her grandmother in their small living room, the photograph and letter clutched tightly in her hand. Grandma, she began, her voice shaking, who is this man? Why was he with Mom? She stretched her hand, showing her grandmother the photo. Her grandmother, who was surprised, asked her how she got to find the picture, and Sophie explained how the box got broken. So Grandma, who is this man and why did Mom write him a letter? She asked again. Her grandmother sighed deeply, her face etched with guilt and sadness. I knew this day would come, she said softly. Taking Sophie's hand, she began to explain. Your mother, Caroline, was a bright and loving woman. She had dreams of a better life, but those dreams were cut short when she fell in love with someone whose status didn't match ours. Your father's parents disapproved of their relationship because of her background. They thought their love could conquer all, but unfortunately after your father learned of your mother's pregnancy, he disappeared without a trace. It was months after that we heard of him traveling out and getting married to another woman chosen by his family. She was devastated. She couldn't believe her ears. She tried contacting him, but to no avail. Oftentimes she wrote letters, but none came with a response. Your mother moved from a once cheerful and charming person to a sad and pained soul. I watched your mother, my daughter, cry herself to sleep each night, hoping and longing that a day would come when her love would come back to her. I tried everything possible to fill in the gap that your father created, but I couldn't, and then I hoped that maybe, just maybe, your birth would be all she needed to find closure, but unfortunately tragedy struck. She passed away during your birth, Sophie. My precious Caroline died. Mrs. Lucy continued amidst sobs. It broke my heart to lose her, but seeing that she left me with the most precious gift, her daughter, which is you, I promised myself that I was going to give you the best of life. Your father returned after 8 years. He met with me one day at the shop, apologizing over everything that happened. He told me how his parents orchestrated his travel, arranged his marriage and cloned all his lines and gadget, hence he wasn't able to reach your mother. He had come back to make things right, to start anew with the love of his life after the death of his arranged wife 2 years before his arrival, and also to meet with his child. He wanted to take responsibility, but I didn't let him. I saw him as a man who killed my daughter. I was enraged and refused to let him in our lives. He frequented here often in the past years, but I stood my ground. I filed for a police restraining order, and he stopped coming but never stopped sending money and gifts, which I rejected each time, until recently, after I was diagnosed of leukemia and we spent every dime I had saved up, I had no choice but to sought for him. I didn't want you to drop out of school because we had nothing. He was glad I finally let him take responsibility, so he persuaded that you go to one of the best schools. I never wanted to introduce him to you yet, which made us come up with a plan of sending you to Eastwood College under the disguise of a scholarship program. That way you wouldn't find out or question where and how I am able to get enough money to switch you from your local school to one of the top schools. Her grandma spoke amidst tears. The weight of her grandmother's words sank in. Oh, Damien Steele is my biological father?" Sophie asked. Her grandmother's eyes glistened. "Yes, my dear. He's your father." The room was calm. Sophie didn't know how to feel. Anger, confusion, and sadness swirled within her. The reality glaring at her was daring. The next day during school hours, Sophie avoided Ethan entirely, unsure how to begin to tell him, but she couldn't concentrate during class. Finally, fate forced her hand. Her heart raced as she waited for the final bell. When it rang, she made her way to the library, where she knew Ethan liked to spend his afternoons. The school library was eerily quiet when Sophie found Ethan sitting alone, a book open in front of him. She hesitated at the entrance, clutching the photo and letter tightly in her hands. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice shaking. He looked up, his gray eyes softening when he saw her. "Hey, I was wondering where you were. I haven't seen you all day." His smile faded as he noticed her expression. "What's wrong?" Sophie sat down across from him and slid the photograph and letter onto the table. "You need to see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's brows furrowed as he picked up the items. As he read the letter, the color drained from his face. His hands shook slightly, and he looked up at Sophie, his silver-gray eyes wide as if lost. "Who's this woman, and why do you have an old copy of my dad?" he queried softly. "I found it in my old late mother's box. Your father and my mother were once lovers, and I am the fruit from their love," Sophie said, her voice failing. This can't be true," Ethan stammered, his voice cracking. "It is," Sophie whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Ethan, your dad is my—" Before she could complete her sentence, Ethan stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his breathing uneven. "No," he said firmly. "This has to be some kind of mistake." Sophie shook her head, her heart breaking. "It's not. I've double-checked everything. My grandmother told me. We're step up," Ethan said. "I know," he said with a wink. "Ethan, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. His face contorted with pain as he stepped back, as though trying to distance himself from the truth as he paced the room. "All this time," he muttered. "All this time I thought—" He stopped, looking at her with a mixture of heartbreak and longing. "Sophie, I love you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Do you understand that? I've loved you from the moment I saw you." Her heart shattered at the anguish in his voice, tears flowing freely down her cheek. "Ethan, I care about you too, but this changes everything. We